Clara May Loring moved through the town of Laramie like a whisper, and the whispers followed her. At 19 years old, she was a shadow cast by the tall, stark figure of her father, Preacher Loring. She was the girl whose mother had bled out giving life to her, a stain that, in the eyes of the righteous, had never washed clean. The town, built on windswept prairie and sanctimonious judgment, treated her with a careful, fearful distance. They called her ghost-touched. They said she was odd, cursed, strange. Mrs. Gable, at the mercantile, would weigh the flour with one eye on the scales and the other on Clara, as if expecting her to curdle the milk with a glance. The children were forbidden to play with her, warned that she carried the taint of death. Her life was a small, tight box, the parsonage, the church, the mercantile, and back. Her father's sermons were her only lessons, and often she felt they were aimed directly at her back row pew. He spoke of sin, of tainted blood, of the wages of Eve's transgression, and his cold, blue eyes would find hers. He never spoke of her mother. He never spoke of love. He only spoke of duty, and Clara's duty was to be silent, to be pious, and to bear her invisible cross without complaint. But beneath the gray wool of her dress, Clara May was not silent. She was a roiling sea of unspoken defiance. She kept a small, pressed wildflower in her Bible, a spot of color in a world of black and white. She would walk near the creek, far from prying eyes, and speak to the cottonwoods, her voice hoarse from disuse. She longed for something she could not even name. She was desperate for a horizon wider than the one defined by the church steeple. She was suffocating, and she knew, with a dreadful certainty, that if something did not change, she would simply fade away. Another ghost in a town that already believed her to be one. Into this brittle, dry town rode Eli Ramsey. He arrived not with a bang, but with a cloud of alkali dust and the jingle of a tired horse. He was a man carved from the unforgiving land, all lean muscle, sun-baked leather, and rough edges. His eyes, the color of a cloudy sky, were sharp and missed nothing. He had no family to speak of, no plans beyond the next town, and no patience for the kind of God-fearing folk who looked down their noses at a man with dust on his boots and a pistol on his hip. Eli was looking for work, maybe a few weeks breaking broncs for the two-bar ranch. But first, he was looking for a whiskey. He found it at the Red Garter Saloon. The Red Garter was the town's sinful heart, a place of smoke, spilled liquor, and the sharp snap of playing cards. Eli Ramsey fit into it as if he were born there. He drank. He kept to himself, and when invited to a game of poker, he won. He won steadily, quietly, with a face that gave away nothing. The pile of chips in front of him grew. The ranch hands from the two-bar, men named Jeb and Cully, grew louder and drunker as their own piles shrank. "Another $1, Eli said, his voice a low rumble. He pushed the chip into the pot. Jeb, a big man with a mean streak widened by liquor, slammed his empty glass down. "Damn it all, Ramsey, you got the devil's own luck." Eli just looked at him, his sharp eyes unblinking. "Luck's got naught to do with it. Friend, you play your cards, I play mine. He plays us, is what he does." Cully slurred, trying to focus on his hand. The pot grew. Eli won again. Jeb threw his cards down in disgust, shoving back from the table. "I'm tapped." He glared at Eli, his frustration searching for a target. "You ride in here, slick as you please. Take our money. Think you're better than us?" "I just think I play poker better," Eli said, calmly stacking his winnings. Jeb's eyes scanned the room, landing on nothing and everything. He was angry, drunk, and humiliated. "You think you're a brave man, Ramsey? Think you can handle anything this town throws at you?" Eli finished his whiskey. "I handle what needs handlin'." A cruel, drunken smile spread across Jeb's face. He'd found his target. "Oh, yeah? I reckon there's one thing in this town you ain't got the sand for." "That's so?" Eli said, bored. "That's so." Jeb leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial roar that filled the saloon. "I'm talking about the preacher's daughter, Clara May." A few men snickered. Eli's face remained flat. "The ghost-touched girl," Cully added, laughing. "Skinny thing. Spooks the cattle just looking at him. They say she's cursed." Jeb continued, warming to his theme. "Say no man's fool enough to court her, let alone—" He grinned. I wager $50 you ain't brave enough to marry her. Ramsey." The saloon went quiet, then burst into laughter. Marry the preacher's odd daughter? It was a joke, a cruel one, but a fine one for a drunken Saturday night. Eli Ramsey looked at the laughing faces. He saw their mockery, their petty, sanctimonious cruelty. They were laughing at him, but they were also laughing at a girl they'd branded as a freak. A cold anger, far deeper than the whiskey, settled in his gut. He hated these men. He hated their small, judgmental world. And in that moment, fueled by drink and a profound, reckless defiance, he made a decision. He stood up, towering over Jeb. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the laughter like a blade. "You got $50 that says I won't?" Jeb's smile faltered. Yeah, I got it. Then it's a bet." Eli grabbed his winnings, stuffing the bills and coins into his pocket. "You'll have your laugh, and I'll have your money." He walked out of the saloon, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. The next day was Sunday. Clara May was walking home from the church service, her father a rigid pace ahead of her. The sermon had been about the snares of vanity, and she felt the familiar sting of it, though she owned nothing finer than her one gray dress. "Clara May." She stopped. No one called her name. Not like that. She turned. It was the new man, the one she'd seen at the Mercantile yesterday. He was tall, broad, and looked dangerously out of place in the Sunday quiet. He had washed the trail dust from his face, but he still wore his gun belt. He was standing in the middle of the street, hat in hand. Townsfolk, leaving the church, stopped to watch. "Miss Loring," he said, correcting himself. He walked toward her, ignoring her father's thunderous expression. "Sir?" Clara's voice was a breath. Eli Ramsey stopped a respectable 3 feet from her. He looked directly into her eyes, and she felt a jolt, a shock of being truly seen. His gaze was intense, unwavering. "My name is Eli Ramsey," he said, his voice clear in the sudden, pressing silence of the street. "I ain't a man for pretty words. Miss Loring, I have a small homestead north of here. I'm looking for a wife." Clara's heart stopped. She could feel the eyes of the entire town on her. She could feel her father's fury radiating beside her. "This is an outrage," Preacher Loring snapped. "Mr. Ramsey, you are addressing my daughter. This is not—" "I am addressing the lady," Eli said, his eyes never leaving Clara's. "I'm asking you to be my wife." Clara stared at him. Her mind was a blank. White sheet, a proposal, a man, this rough, strong stranger, was asking to marry her. The cursed girl, the ghost-touched woman. A hysterical laugh bubbled in her chest, but she choked it down. She saw Mrs. Gable's mouth hanging open. She saw Jeb and Cully lurking near the saloon, wide-eyed with disbelief. And she saw him, Eli Ramsey. He wasn't laughing. His face was serious, almost grim. In that moment, Clara May did not see a bet. She did not see a joke. She saw a man who was not afraid of her. She saw a man who looked at her not as a curse, but as a woman. She saw a way out. A door had opened in the small, tight box of her life. It was a dark and frightening door, but it was open. "Clara May," her father warned, his voice low and dangerous. "You will come home, now." She looked from her father's cold fury to Eli Ramsey's steady gaze. For the first time in her life, she made a choice that was entirely her own. "Yes," she whispered. Then, louder, so the whole town could hear, so her father would know she meant it, she said, "Yes, I will." The wedding was arranged with a speed that left the town breathless and Clara May dizzy. Preacher Loring fought it, thundering about damnation and impropriety. But Clara, having made her stand, held to it with the tenacity of a starving woman offered bread. Eli Ramsey was immovable. He had secured the license. He had paid the preacher's fee. The wedding would be that afternoon. Her father, trapped by his own public office and his daughter's shocking defiance, had no choice but to perform the ceremony. Clara stood in the empty church, wearing her mother's wedding dress, a simple, yellowed linen gown she had found packed in a trunk. It was the only beautiful thing she had ever owned. She was frightened. Her hands trembled so badly she could barely hold the small bunch of prairie wildflowers she had picked that morning. But she was also thrilled. A wild, terrifying current was running through her. She was leaving her father's house. She was leaving the whispers and the judgment. She was getting married. She was being touched, claimed. The weight of Eli's hand on her arm as they stood before the altar was the first kind, firm touch she had known. Eli stood beside her, a stranger in a clean shirt. His face was unreadable, stoic. He spoke his vows in a low, clear voice that echoed in the empty pews. "I, Eli, take thee, Clara May." When it was her turn, her voice shook. "I, Clara May, take thee, Eli." Her father's voice was like the crack of ice as he pronounced them man and wife. "You may kiss the bride?" Eli turned to her. His sharp eyes searched her face. He hesitated for just a second. Then his hand came up to cup her jaw. His thumb was rough against her skin. He leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. It was brief, firm, and tasted of tobacco and something wild. It was her first kiss. It was the first real brush with freedom, and it sealed her fate. Eli had rented a wagon. Her father did not see her off. She climbed onto the hard wooden seat beside her new husband, her small carpet bag at her feet, and they rode out of Laramie as the sun began to dip below the prairie. They rode in silence to his homestead. It was not a ranch. It was a small, raw cabin, barely more than a shack, hunkered down against the wind on a desolate patch of land. A crude corral held his horse. It was the loneliest place she'd ever seen. Inside, it was dark. A single room, a cold stove, a narrow bed frame in the corner, a rough table. A storm was brewing outside. The wind was rising, whistling through the cracks in the rough-hewn logs. I'll start a fire," Eli said. His voice sounded strange in the small space. Clara stood by the door, her hands clenched, the thrill of the wedding fading into a cold, stark fear. This was her new life. This was her wedding night. She was alone, miles from anything, with a man she did not know. He worked at the stove, striking a match, feeding wood into the small firebox. The room slowly filled with a smoky warmth. Clara stayed by the door, her coat still buttoned. You can set your things down," he said, not looking at her. She nodded, though he couldn't see. She put her bag on the floor. The tension in the cabin was so thick she could barely breathe. He was her husband. She knew what was expected. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach. And then she heard it. Over the rising howl of the wind, she heard voices, laughter, men on horseback. "He's in there, with the ghost!" It was Jeb's booming, drunken voice. $50, shouted Cully, his laugh high and wheezing. "He really did it! He married the witch!" Clara froze. The blood drained from her face. "Wonder if he's collected his money yet," Jeb roared. "Or maybe he's too scared to touch her. $50 bride. Ramsey, was she worth it?" Their laughter was swept away by the wind as they rode on, but the words remained, hanging in the cabin like poison. $50 bride. Was she worth it? A bet. The room tilted. The stove. The table. The man standing by the fire. It all dissolved into a roaring in her ears. A bet. It was all a bet. His proposal on the street. His serious, steady gaze. The town's shock. Her father's fury. Her escape. It was a lie. All of it. A cruel, humiliating joke played by drunken cowboys. And she was the punchline. The humiliation was a physical thing, a sickness that rose in her throat, hotter than shame, hotter than fear, was a white-hot, blinding rage. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply turned. Her hand found the latch on the door, and she ripped it open. The storm hit her like a physical blow, wind and driving rain, cold as ice. She didn't care. She ran barefoot. Her mother's wedding dress instantly soaked and heavy, the cold mud sucking at her feet. She ran with no destination, fueled only by a heartbroken, humiliated agony. She would not stay. She would not be his $50 bride. She would rather die in the storm than spend one more second in that cabin with the man who had bought her for a laugh. She didn't get far. She heard the cabin door slam, heard his boots pounding the ground behind her. He was faster. Of course he was faster. He tackled her. They went down hard in the slick, cold mud. Clara came up fighting, screaming, her nails raking for his face. She was a wild thing, all teeth and fury, fueled by a lifetime of shame that had just found its focus. "Let me go," she shrieked, her voice tearing in the wind. "You liar! You filthy liar!" Eli grunted as her fist connected with his jaw. He didn't hit her back, he just endured, grabbing her flailing wrists, his strength overwhelming. He hauled her up out of the mud, his arms locking around her like iron bands. She was slick with rain, bucking against him. "Stop fighting me, woman!" he roared over the storm. "It was a bet!" she screamed, the rain and her tears mixing, her voice breaking. "It was all a bet!" "Aye," he yelled back, and the single word stopped her struggle for a second. He didn't deny it. "It was a bet. That's how it started." He began to drag her, half carrying, half pulling her, back toward the cabin. She kicked and fought, but it was useless. "But it ends with you being my wife," he snarled, his face close to hers, his eyes a dark fury in the rain. "I'm not letting you go." He threw the cabin door open and shoved her inside, slamming it shut against the storm and bolting it. Clara stumbled, catching herself on the table. She was covered in mud, her hair plastered to her face, her mother's dress ruined. She was shivering, but not from cold. It was rage. It was a betrayal so deep it felt like it had cracked her bones. She backed against the far wall, a trapped animal. "You married me for a bet," she cried, the words ripped from her throat. "For $50, for a laugh from those drunken fools." Eli stood opposite her, his clothes soaked, his chest heaving. Rain and mud dripped from him onto the rough floorboards. He didn't apologize. He didn't offer excuses. He just stared at her, his dark eyes burning. He took a step toward her. I did." His confession was colder than the rain. "And you," he said, his voice a low, rough growl. "You married me to escape your daddy. You married me before you even knew my name. So do not stand there and tell me about lies." The truth of it hit her as hard as his tackle in the mud. They were both liars. In their own way. They had used each other. She slapped him. It was not a weak, flimsy slap. It was the full, desperate force of her entire life's humiliation. The sound of it cracked through the sound of the wind. He didn't flinch. He just caught her wrist, his grip crushing. The fight, the fury, the last of her strength, just broke. It drained out of her, leaving her hollow, cold, and utterly defeated. She began to sob, great, tearing sobs that shook her entire body. He stood there for a long second, holding her wrist, watching her. The storm raged outside. The fire in the stove crackled. Then he pulled her to him. It was not a gentle embrace. It was a claiming. He yanked her against his hard, wet body. His other hand tangled in her wet hair, tilting her head back. She looked up at him, her vision blurred by tears. "You are my wife, Clara May," he said, his voice raw. And he kissed her. It was not the chaste, brief kiss from the church. This was a brutal, punishing kiss, a kiss of anger and possession and a terrible, undeniable hunger. She fought him for a moment, her hands beating against his chest, and then, in a wave of pure, confusing despair, she stopped fighting. She grabbed his shirt, her fingers clenching the wet fabric, and she kissed him back. It was a kiss of betrayal. It was a kiss of fury. It was a kiss that said she was lost, and so was he. It was the only thing in the world that felt real. He broke the kiss only to lift her from her feet. She was light in his arms. He carried her the few steps to the narrow bed, and they fell onto the thin mattress. A tangle of wet clothes, cold mud, and burning, desperate shame. They did not speak of love. They did not speak at all. There was only the sound of the storm, and their own ragged breathing, and the raw, desperate, furious collision of two people who had nothing left to lose. And in the cold, dark cabin, on their wedding night, they did not sleep apart. The morning after the storm was brutally clear and cold. The world was washed clean, and the cabin, in the sharp light of dawn, looked even smaller and more desperate. Clara woke first, her body a map of aches. She was still in the damp, muddy ruin of her mother's dress. Beside her, Eli slept, his breathing heavy. She slid from the bed, her bare feet hitting the cold floor. Shame, cold and sharp, cut through her. She was his wife. The thought was a sickness. She was a $50 bride. She found her bag, pulled out her gray wool dress, and changed, her back to the sleeping man. She scrubbed her face with icy water from the basin, her hands shaking. She stared at the woman in the small, cracked piece of mirror Eli had nailed to the wall. The same face, the same cursed girl. Nothing had changed. When Eli woke, she was stoking the fire in the stove. She had found the coffee, and it was boiling, a bitter, dark smell filling the room. He sat up, ran a hand through his hair, and looked at her. Clara did not look back. She poured him a cup, set it on the rough-hewn table, and turned away. The silence began that day. It was a heavy, thick thing, a third presence in the tiny cabin. It settled over them like the first winter snow, and it did not lift. The next few weeks fell into a grim, wordless routine. Winter arrived in earnest, a white tyrant that locked them in. The wind howled from the north, piling drifts of snow against the door, rattling the poorly fitted window frame. The world shrank to the 4 log walls of the cabin. Clara was silent, distant. She moved like a phantom, her face pale and pinched. She did her work. She cooked the salt pork and beans. She mended the tears in Eli's shirts. She swept the floor, but her eyes were always averted, her expression closed. She was a fortress of mistrust. Eli, for his part, was just as silent. He was a man of action, and the shame of it, had stunned him into a grim quiet. He accepted the coffee she handed him each morning with a curt nod. He ate the food she cooked without comment, but he worked. He worked with a furious, driving energy, as if he could beat back the shame with sweat and labor. He rose before dawn, the cabin still dark and frigid, and went out to care for the horses. He chopped wood for hours, the rhythmic thwack of his axe the only sound for miles. He was showing her, in the only language he knew, that he was not the drunken fool from the saloon. He was showing her that he was staying. One afternoon, the wind drove a hard sleet that found a dozen new ways to leak through the sod roof. Water dripped onto the table, onto her bed, onto the floor. Clara put pots and tins beneath the leaks. The plink, plink, plink of the water, a new, maddening percussion in their silent war. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the air was biting. Eli hauled a ladder from the side of the cabin and climbed onto the roof. Clara watched him from the window, her hands twisting in her apron. He worked up there for 2 full days, in the freezing, dangerous wind. He replaced shingles. He repacked the sod, his movements economical and sure. He never looked down. He never asked for help. She watched his hands, raw and red with the cold, skillfully driving nails. He was mending the roof. He was sheltering her. The thought was unwelcome, and she pushed it away. Her horse, a thin mare named Promise, shivered in the open corral, her back to the wind. It was the only living thing Clara felt any kinship with, the only piece of her old life she had been allowed to bring. A few days after fixing the roof, Eli began building again. He worked near the cabin, digging post holes in the frozen ground, cutting wood. She thought he was building a woodshed, but the structure took shape against the lee side of the cabin, enclosed, roofed, a lean-to, a shelter for Promise. When it was finished, he led the mare inside, out of the wind. He gave her a measure of oats, his own supply. Clara stood at the door, watching. Her throat felt thick. He had done it for her. It was a gesture so plain, so clear, that it hurt. It was a kindness, and kindness was a weapon she did not know how to fight. That evening, he came in late, the cold clinging to him. He walked to the table and set something down. A small, tight bunch of wildflowers, purple and hardy, that he must have found in a patch of sunlight beneath a rock. He pushed the tin cup toward her. Clara looked at the flowers. They were beautiful. They were a plea. And because they were a plea, she could not accept them. To accept them would be to forgive. To forgive was to forget. And she would not forget. She was the $50 bride. She turned her back to him, her shoulders rigid, and began to knead the dough for their bread. Eli stood there for a long minute. She could feel his eyes on her back. Then, she heard the scrape of his chair as he sat down, the silence stretching between them, heavier and colder than before. The flowers wilted on the table, untouched, but the days, so cold and separate, gave way to the nights. The cabin had one bed. The floor was drafty and cold. The first night, after her tears, they had fallen into a desperate, tangled sleep. The nights that followed were no different. They would undress in the dim light of the dying fire, their backs to each other, the small movements precise, practiced. They would slide into the narrow bed, lying stiffly, a foot of cold blankets between them. But the cabin was small, and the cold was deep, and the memory of that first night, the raw collision of anger and shame, had lit a fuse. He would turn to her, or she would turn to him. A hand would brush an arm, a leg would touch a leg, and it would begin. It was never gentle. It was a raw, hungry, wordless thing. It was a desperate clawing for warmth, for release, for something, anything, to feel. It was the only time the silence broke. Their passion was real, a dark, powerful current that ran beneath the ice of their days. It was the one truth in the cabin, but it was not love. It was desperation. In the dark, he would take her, and she would take him back, their bodies speaking a language their mouths would not. It was a fight, and it was a surrender. And when it was over, they would turn away from each other, the silence rushing back in, absolute and unbroken. The emotions, the shame, the anger, the flicker of a terrifying, unwanted dependency. It all stayed buried, unspoken in the cold dark. This truce of daytime silence and nighttime fire lasted for 3 weeks. Clara felt herself breaking. The monotony, the isolation, the man who was her husband in every way but name. It was too much. The shame of the bet had faded, replaced by the more immediate shame of her own body's betrayal, her own desperate need for the very man she despised. One morning, she watched him ride out, his rifle on his saddle. He was checking the trap lines he had set for rabbits. He would be gone for hours. She moved the moment he was over the ridge. Her hands, which had been so slow all morning, were now quick, frantic. She pulled her carpet bag from under the bed. She packed her gray dress, her brush, the few things she owned. She went to the pantry. Her hands hesitated. Then, with a defiant sob, she took a sack of flour, a slab of bacon, and a tin of coffee. He owed her that. She was buttoning her coat, her heart hammering against her ribs. When the cabin door opened, he stood there. He was not supposed to be back. He had circled, watching the cabin, as if he knew. Clara froze, her hand on the last button. He looked at her. He looked at the bag on the floor. He looked at the pantry, at the food she had taken. His face, which she had come to know so well, the hard jaw, the sharp eyes, was completely still. He did not yell. He did not move to grab her. She expected him to drag her back, as he had from the storm. She braced for it. Instead, he unslung his own saddlebag from his shoulder. It was heavy, made of thick leather, and clearly held his most valuable possessions. He held it out to her. "Take it," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of anger. Clara stared at the bag, confused. "It's a long walk back to Laramie." 50 miles, more. You'll need it. It's got jerky, a bedroll, and my spare ammunition. You can trade it for a warm meal." He pushed it toward her again. "Take it." She looked from the bag to his face. He was not stopping her. He was helping her. "But if you do," he continued, his voice quiet but as hard as frozen iron, "if you walk out that door, don't ever come back." The words hung in the air. This was not the chase in the storm. This was not a fight she could win with nails and teeth. This was a choice, a real choice. She looked past him, through the open door, at the vast, white, unforgiving emptiness of the prairie. 50 miles, alone, back to her father's cold house, back to the whispers. The cursed wife, the girl who had been married and abandoned, or worse, had run away. She would be a pariah, more so than ever. Her father would lock her in. Her life would be over. She looked at the cabin. It was a prison. It was a shack, but it was warm. The roof did not leak. Her horse was sheltered. She looked at Eli. He was her shame. He was her betrayer. And he was the man who had climbed on a freezing roof for her, who had built a shelter for her horse, who had just offered her his own bag for her survival. Her hand, the one reaching for the saddlebag, began to tremble. She could not take it. She could not go. With a small, broken sound, Clara May let her hand fall to her side. She sank onto the small stool by the fire. Her escape, her rebellion, dissolving into the cold reality. She had nowhere else to go. This was her life. Eli watched her for a long moment. He hung his saddlebag back on the peg by the door. He did not say a word. He just took off his coat, added a log to the fire, and the silence, heavier than ever, resumed. A week later, they needed supplies. They rode to Laramie together, the wagon wheels crunching on the frozen ruts. Clara kept her face hidden in the collar of her coat. She had not been back since her wedding day. The town felt different. It felt hostile. As they walked into the mercantile, the half-dozen people inside stopped talking. Mrs. Gable, her face pinched with smug piety, looked Clara up and down. "Preacher's girl," she said, just loud enough for the room to hear. "Come for more charity. We're here for flour, salt, and coffee," Eli said, his voice a low warning. He put a stack of coins on the counter. "Heard you got it for a good price, Ramsey." A man by the stove chimed in. $50, wasn't it? Poor fool. "Mrs." Gable muttered, weighing the flour with deliberate slowness. "Trapped himself good. Still, I suppose even a cursed wife is a wife." Clara flinched, her face burning. Cursed wife. Fool. Eli's hand moved, so fast she almost didn't see it, and rested on the butt of his pistol. The men by the stove went quiet. "Get the supplies. Clara," he ordered, his voice dangerously soft. He did not take his eyes off the men. She gathered their things, her hands shaking. She could feel every eye in the store on her, picking her apart. When she was done, Eli took the heavy sacks. "Let's go." He walked her out, his hand on her back, a possessive, protective gesture that was as much a threat to the town as it was a comfort to her. They passed the Red Garter Saloon. Jeb and Cully were standing outside. When they saw them, they grinned. Jeb raised an imaginary glass. "To the happy couple," he shouted. Eli did not slow down. He loaded the wagon, helped Clara onto the seat, and they drove out of town, the sound of laughter following them. The ride home was silent, but the silence had changed. It was no longer just between them. It was between them and the world. They were an island, a pariah duo. The town had drawn a line, and they were on the other side of it, together. That night, back in the cabin, Clara felt a desperate need to speak, to scream, to write. She found an old, half-empty ledger of Eli's and a small pencil stub. She waited until he was asleep, by the dying light of the fire. She opened it. She wrote to the mother she never knew. "Mother, they call me the cursed wife. My husband won me in a bet. I hate him, but he is all I have. Am I you? Did you feel this trapped?" She wrote to her father. "You spoke of sin, but you never spoke of cruelty. You let this town poison me. You never defended me. This man, this stranger, he stood up for me in the store today. He is a sinner, I am sure, but I think you are a coward. And finally, her hands shaking, she wrote to Eli, "I cannot speak to you. I see you work. I see the roof you fixed. I see the shelter for my horse. Why did you do it? The bet was won. Why are you still here? At night, I forget who we are. I forget to hate you. I am afraid. I am so afraid." She tore the pages out, folded them, and hid them beneath a loose floorboard under their bed. Weeks turned into a month. The deep winter held. Eli joined a few other small homesteaders for a cattle roundup, a desperate attempt to gather their thin, scattered herds before a new blizzard hit. He was supposed to be gone for 2 days. He was gone for 3. On the third night, the blizzard hit, a wall of white that erased the world. Clara stood at the window, peering into the swirling nothingness. She was alone. The cabin, which had been her prison, now felt terrifyingly empty. She told herself she was glad for the quiet. She told herself she hoped he would not come back. She was a liar. On the 4th morning, the storm had broken. She saw a horse, a dark shape struggling through the deep drifts. It was not Eli's horse. It was another homesteader, a man named Silas. Eli was slumped over his own saddle, tied on. "Mrs. Ramsey!" Silas yelled, his voice hoarse. "He's hurt. Bad." Clara was out the door in an instant, wading through the snow. Eli was pale, his face beaded with sweat despite the cold. His leg was wrapped in a bloody, frozen rag. "A steer gored him," Silas panted. "Caught him in the thigh. He's lost a lot of blood, and the fever's set in." The silence, the mistrust, the weeks of bitterness. It all evaporated. Clara was her father's daughter in one way. She was not faint of heart. And she was her mother's daughter in another. She knew things the town called strange. She knew herbs. "Get him inside," she ordered, her voice sharp and clear, a voice neither man had ever heard from her. "On the bed, now." They hauled him in. Eli was delirious, muttering, his body burning. "Silas," she said, "fill every pot with snow and put it on the stove to boil, and get me my bag, the one with the dried herbs." For the next 2 days, Clara did not sleep. She was a general in a war for one. She cut the frozen, bloody pants from his leg. The wound was deep, ragged, and infected, an angry purple gash. She cleaned it with boiled water and whiskey. She stitched it closed with her own sewing needle and thread, her hands steady, her face grim. She forced a bitter tea of yarrow and willow bark, the herbs she had gathered in secret by the creek, between his fever-cracked lips. She bathed his face with snowmelt. Her touch, which had been so hesitant or so desperate, now becoming gentle, efficient, and firm. He fought her. He was back in the storm, back in the roundup. He cursed, he thrashed. On the second night, the fever was at its peak. She was terrified he would die. She was terrified to be alone again. She knelt by the bed, wiping his face with a wet rag. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. He seemed to be fading. "Eli?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Eli, you cannot. Do you hear me? You stay. You made me stay. Now you stay." His eyes flickered. He turned his head, searching for her. His hand, calloused and hot, found hers, his grip surprisingly strong. "Clara," he mumbled, his voice thick. "Clara May." "I am here," she sobbed, leaning closer. "I am here." He was quiet for a moment, his eyes still shut tight, as if in great pain. Then he said the word. One word. A low, feverish growl. A statement of fact. A brand. Mine. The word struck her. It was not the possessive anger of their wedding night. It was not the desperate lust of the dark. It was a simple, profound claim, uttered from the depths of his delirium. Mine. It broke her. Clara pulled her hand free. She stumbled back from the bed, her knuckles pressed to her mouth. The wall she had built, the silence, the hatred, the mistrust, it all shattered, washing away in a sudden, violent flood. She slid down the rough cabin wall until she was sitting on the cold floor. She put her head in her hands, and for the first time since she had run from this cabin, she wept. It was not a cry of humiliation. It was a cry of pure, terrifying and unwelcome truth. She did not want this man to die. Eli's fever broke on the 5th day. He woke to the smell of broth and the sight of Clara May sitting in the stool by the stove, her hands patching his torn shirt. Her face was pale, shadowed with exhaustion, but her eyes, when they met his, were clear. The mistrust was gone, replaced by a deep, weary watchfulness. He was weak. The wound in his thigh throbbed with a dull, clean pain, a vast improvement on the fire of infection. He lay there for a long time, just watching her. She moved with a quiet efficiency he had come to know, but the brittle anger was gone from her shoulders. "You're awake," she said. It was not a question. She put the shirt down and ladled broth into a tin cup. She helped him sit up, her arm under his back. He was struck by the wiry strength in her. She was not the frail, ghost-touched girl from town. She was made of something tougher. He drank the broth. It was thin, but hot, and tasted of rabbit and herbs. "You've been out for a time," she said, taking the empty cup. "Silas," Eli managed, his voice a dry croak. "He left 2 days ago. Said he'd be back to check. You were—" She hesitated, looking at the wound she had stitched. "You were near gone. You stitched me." He touched the clean bandage. "Aye." She nodded, turning away to wash the cup. And just like that, the silence was broken. It did not rush back in. It was replaced by the small, necessary sounds of convalescence. For a week, he was her patient. He was entirely at her mercy. And she was a stern but gentle nurse. She fed him. She cleaned his wound, her touch firm and impersonal. She brought him water. She did not, however, speak of that night. She did not mention the word he had spoken from his fever. But the shift had happened, deep and undeniable. As his strength returned, the cabin felt different. It was still small, still isolated, but it was no longer a prison shared by 2 enemies. It was a shelter. The first day he was able to sit at the table. She did not retreat to her stool. She sat opposite him, her hands busy with her mending. "My pa's Bible is the only book I have," she said one afternoon, her voice quiet. He had been staring at the logs in the wall for an hour, his mind restless. I could read to you, if you like, to pass the time." Eli, who had not been read to since he was a small boy, just nodded. "Aye, that'd be fine." She read from the book of Job. Her voice was low and steady, but as she read about a man afflicted, tested, and surrounded by loss, Eli heard her own life in the verses. She was not reading about Job, she was reading about herself. When she finished the chapter, she closed the book. "You read good," he said, simply. She looked at him, a small, surprised flicker in her eyes. My mother taught me. Before, she loved books." It was the first time she had mentioned her mother. Eli seized on the opening, hungry to know the woman who sat across from him. "Tell me about her." Clara traced the cover of the Bible. "I don't remember her. I only know what they say." She stopped. "What do they say?" "That she died giving birth to me," Clara whispered, her eyes dropping to her lap. "That she bled out on the floor of the parsonage, and my father prayed over her while she died. They say I carry it. The curse, Mrs. Gable told me once that I was born of sin and death, and that I would bring the same to any man who touched me." She finally looked up at him, her face naked with a fear so old it was part of her bones. "That's why they call me ghost-touched. That's why I was so afraid. Why I believed. I am so lonely. Eli, I have been so lonely my entire life." Eli looked at this woman, who had fought him in a storm, who had stitched his flesh back together with a sewing needle, who had faced down the town's scorn. He saw not a curse, but a terrible, aching strength. The bet, the $50, the drunken laughter in the saloon. It all seemed like a lifetime ago, a filthy, childish thing. My brother, Silas, not the neighbor, my own blood. He was killed in a range war down in Texas, Eli said, his voice rough. He had not spoken of this to anyone. We was just kids, hired on as guns. He took a bullet meant for me, died in my arms. I buried him myself. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his eyes holding hers. After that, I just drifted. I didn't care about nothing. Not God, not folks, not myself. I drank. I fought. I pretended. Pretended I was tough. Pretended I didn't care. He looked down at his hands, calloused and scarred. When Jeb and Cully made that bet, I was drunk. But more than that, I was angry. Angry at them, at their stupid town, at their sanctimonious preacher. I saw how they talked about you, like you wasn't even a person. He met her gaze again, his own full of a raw, painful honesty. The bet was a mistake. Clara May, a stupid, drunken mistake. But stayin', he shook his head, the truth of it settling on him even as he spoke it. Stayin', that was the truth. The first true thing I'd done in 5 years. When I woke up that first morning, I knew I wasn't leaving. And when I saw you on that roof, God help me, I ain't ever seen anything so strong. They sat in the quiet, the weight of their confessions filling the small cabin. She was not a curse. He was not just a fool. They were two broken, lonely people, brought together by a cruel joke and held there by something they did not yet have a name for. When Eli was strong enough to walk, the winter broke, but it broke badly. The snow melted, running off the hard-baked earth in muddy streams. And then, nothing. The sky, which had been a heavy, pregnant gray for months, turned a pale, metallic blue. The sun, which had been a stranger, now became a tyrant. The prairie did not turn green, it turned brown. The wind, which had carried ice, now carried dust. Drought, Eli said, standing at the cabin door, his weight on his good leg. He squinted at the horizon. If we don't get rain in 2 weeks, the creek will dry up, and the grass will be gone. Their fragile peace was already being tested. The homestead, which was really just a collection of hopes and debts, was in danger. They had his horse, her mare, and the 24 head of cattle he'd been running on the open range. Without water, they would have to sell the cattle for pennies. Without the cattle, they would not survive the next winter. I can't ride for another week. Not hard, Eli said, the frustration clear in his voice. He slammed his fist against the doorframe. I need to move the herd north, to the high pasture near the Laramie River. There might be grass there. You can't, Clara said, her voice firm. You ride that far, your leg will open up. You'll die out there. And if I sit here, we starve. She looked at him, her mind working. The woman who had packed her bag to flee was gone. In her place was a woman who was looking at a threat to her home. Her home. No, she said. We won't. She went to the trunk where she kept her mother's dress. Tucked in the bottom was a small tin box. She opened it. Inside was fine needlework, lace collars, embroidered handkerchiefs, things she had made in the long, lonely hours at the parsonage. This is fine work, she said, holding up a collar. Mrs. Gable, for all her piety, loves finery. And the banker's wife, I can sew shirts, men dresses, I can trade, and... She hesitated, then plunged on. And I know herbs. My mother's people, they knew them. I can make remedies. Silas's wife, she has the rheumatism. I can make her a salve. She can pay in eggs. We can trade. Eli stared at her. She was offering to go back into the town that scorned her. For him, for the ranch. Clara, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You don't have to. Yes, I do, she said, cutting him off. You fix the roof. I'll buy the seed. We fight this. Together. The word hung in the air. Together. Clara began to ride into town once a week. At first, it was hard. Mrs. Gable sniffed at her, but she could not deny the quality of the lace. She bought 2 collars, paying in flour and sugar. Then, Clara went to Silas's homestead. His wife, Mary, was crippled with pain in her hands. Clara gave her the salve she had made. A week later, Mary met her on the road, tears in her eyes, holding out a basket of eggs. It's a miracle, Clara. She said, "The pain, it's half what it was." Mary had a son, a boy of 9 named Thomas. He was bright but shy and could not read a word. "Silas says you read from the book like a scholar," Mary said, twisting her apron. I ain't got much. But could you teach my Tom his letters?" Clara looked at the boy, who was hiding behind his mother's skirts, peering at her with curious eyes. A purpose, sudden and clear, bloomed in her chest. It was more than bartering for eggs. It was a chance to give something she owned. "Yes," Clara said, "I will." She began in secret. Tom would come to the cabin twice a week. While Eli was out checking the increasingly dry creek beds, Clara would teach him with her Bible. Within a month, he could write his name in the dust, the respect she was so desperate for. She found it not in the town, but in the eyes of a child, and in the grateful face of his mother. Word spread. 2 other homesteaders, who lived miles out, heard about it. Soon, Clara had 4 children, sitting on the floor of her cabin, their faces rapt as she taught them the alphabet. She was not the cursed wife. She was teacher. The name felt strange and wonderful. She was shedding the town's scorn, 1 letter at a time. Eli watched it all with a quiet awe. His wife, the ghost-touched girl, was the most respected woman on the prairie, at least among the desperate families who lived far from the town's judgment. His leg healed. He mended fences, his strength returning. He found a new spring, high in the rocks, and spent a week digging it out. Clearing a new pool for the cattle, they worked side by side. She would bring him water while he dug. He would patch the cabin wall while she taught. They fell into a new rhythm, one of partnership. The nights were different, too. The desperate, hungry collisions were replaced by a slower, deeper intimacy. He would touch her hair. She would rest her head on his shoulder. They were learning each other, not as betrayer and betrayed, but as man and woman, as husband and wife. But the drought held. The dust was relentless, and the town remained a source of poison. They rode in one Saturday for supplies, the wagon loaded with Clara's mending and salves. Eli's leg was fully healed, but his temper was short, worn thin by the drought and the endless work. Clara went into the mercantile. Eli stayed with the wagon, loading sacks of feed. A young drifter, new to town, was leaning against the porch railing. He was handsome in a careless way, with a ready smile and bold eyes. He watched Clara as she came out of the store, her arms full. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat, "that looks mighty heavy. A pretty thing like you shouldn't be carrying such a load." He moved to take the parcels from her. Clara, unaccustomed to such easy gallantry, flushed and stepped back. I have it, thank you." "Now, I insist." He smiled, his eyes lingering on her face. "It ain't every day a man sees a prairie rose bloom in all this dust." Clara clutched her parcels tighter. "Please, sir, my husband is waiting." "Husband?" The drifter laughed, a bright, careless sound. "Well, he's a lucky man, keeping a rose like you all to himself." He reached out and, before Clara could stop him, touched a strand of her hair. "Maybe he'd be willing to share." "Get your hand off my wife." Eli's voice was not a shout. It was a low, flat growl, more dangerous than any thunder. He had come around the wagon, his face a dark mask of fury. He was not wearing his gun belt. They didn't wear them for supply runs, but he didn't need it. His hands were clenched into fists, the knuckles white. The drifter's smile vanished. He was young, but he wasn't a fool. He recognized a killing rage when he saw one. He took a step back, his hands raised. "No offense meant, friend," he stammered. "Just being neighborly." "We ain't neighbors." Eli snarled. "And you ain't my friend. You look at her again, you speak to her again, you even think about her again, and I will break you in half. Now get—" The drifter scrambled away, disappearing into the saloon. Clara was trembling. The encounter had been frightening, but what scared her more was the look on Eli's face. It was a raw, possessive fury she hadn't seen since their wedding night. He grabbed the parcels from her, threw them in the wagon, and hauled himself onto the seat. "Get in!" The ride back to the homestead was silent, but it was the old silence, the cold, angry one. Clara's heart sank. When they got to the cabin, he unhitched the team, his movements jerky, violent. Clara began to unpack the supplies, her hands shaking. He stormed into the cabin, his face dark. "You liked that, did you?" he snapped. Clara spun around. "What?" "Him, the drifter. You liked him looking at you, liked him calling you a rose." His jealousy was a tangible thing, raw and bleeding. He was insecure, still the man from the bet, terrified she was comparing him to a younger, handsomer man. "He frightened me," Clara said, her voice small. "You didn't look frightened. You looked pleased." He took a step toward her. "Are you still ashamed? Is that it? Ashamed to be my wife? So you'll take the smiles of any stranger who comes by." It was the accusation he had held in for months. It was his deepest fear. Clara stared at him. The injustice of it. After everything. After the nursing, the teaching, the working together. It broke something in her. All the pain, all the shame, all the words she had swallowed, came rising up in a bitter tide. "Ashamed," she said, her voice shaking with a sudden, cold fury. "You want to speak of shame? Eli Ramsey?" She advanced on him, and it was he who took a step back. "You married me for $50 and a laugh? You stood me up in front of my father in a town that already thought I was dirt. And you lied. You humiliated me. You dragged me through the mud. You took me in this very room because you were angry about a bet." Tears were streaming down her face, but she didn't care. "You made me ashamed," she cried, her voice breaking. "You made me ashamed to be a woman. You made me ashamed to be alive. And now, after all this, after I have worked for this home, our home, you have the gall to ask me if I want your heart?" The question hung in the air. A raw, open wound. It was the truth. It was the heart of it all. He had claimed her, but he had never earned her. He looked at her, stunned. Her words had hit him harder than any fist. He saw her, truly saw her, not as the woman he had saved or the woman he had claimed, but as the woman he had profoundly wronged. "Clara," he whispered, his own anger gone, replaced by a hollow, aching regret. "Clara, He had no words. He reached for her. Not in anger, not in possession, but in a desperate, broken plea. She saw the look on his face, the raw pain that mirrored her own, and the last of her fight went out. She didn't want to fight him. She wanted. She met his embrace, her hands coming up to grip his shirt. "You fool," she sobbed into his chest. "You blind, stubborn fool." "I know," he said, his voice thick, his arms wrapping around her, holding her as if she were the only solid thing on earth. "I know." He kissed her, and it was not like any kiss before. It was not the angry claiming of their wedding night, nor the desperate hunger of the winter, nor the careful tenderness of their healing. This was a kiss of truth. It was a kiss of apology and forgiveness and a terrible, aching need. It was volatile. It was a storm. It was the argument and the answer all at once. He lifted her, his mouth never leaving hers, and carried her to the bed. This time, there was no shame. There was no anger. There was just a raw, unchained honesty. It was a stripping away of all the lies, all the pretenses. He was the man who had hurt her, and he was the man who had stayed. She was the woman who had been betrayed, and she was the woman who had fought for him. And when their bodies joined, in the hot, dusty twilight of the cabin, she cried out. She moaned his name, but it was not a moan of pleasure or of pain. It was a vow. It was an acceptance. It was the sound of a lock, rusted shut for a lifetime. Finally. Turning. It was the shift, and they both felt it. In the dark, long after, they lay tangled, the air still and heavy. He was holding her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Clara May," he whispered. "Hush," she said, and laid her head on his chest. The drought had not broken. The town was still cruel, but in the small cabin, two people had, at last, begun to build a marriage. The drought held. The dust settled on everything, a fine, gritty powder that got in their food, their water, their lungs. But the shift that had happened in the cabin held, too. It was a stubborn, rooted thing, like the one tough cottonwood by the creek that refused to wither. Eli had taken to watching her. He watched her teach the 4 homestead children, her voice patient and clear. He watched her grind herbs, her hands sure and knowing. He watched her stand at the cabin door and stare at the metallic sky, her expression not one of defeat, but of calculation. He was watching a stranger he had known for months, a woman he had married, a wife he was only just meeting. One evening, he was late. The sun was a dull red smear in the west, and the air was finally cooling. Clara was by the creek, drawing their water for the night, the level now dangerously low, a mere trickle over the stones. He came up behind her quietly. She didn't startle. She had begun to learn the sound of his walk. He stood beside her, looking at the dying stream. "It'll be dry in a week," he said, his voice flat. "We'll have to dig then," she said, just as flatly. "There's water under it." He looked at her, at the practicality of her, the sheer refusal to break. His heart felt tight in his chest, a feeling he was not used to. He had wronged this woman, profoundly. He had taken her in a storm, in anger. He had claimed her with lust and shame, but he had never chosen her. Not in the light. "Clara May," he said, his voice rough. She straightened up, the heavy bucket in her hand, and looked at him. That day in the church," he started, finding the words difficult. "With your father, that wasn't a marriage. That was a sentence, for both of us." She waited, her eyes on his face. "I can't undo the bet," he said, and the shame of it was still there, a dull ache in his gut. "I can't wash that clean. Lord knows I've tried." "Eli." "No, let me finish." He took the bucket from her hand, setting it down. He took her hands. They were rough, calloused from work, no longer the pale, unused hands of the preacher's daughter. "I didn't marry you, Clara. I won you. I stole you. But I want to marry you. For real. Not for a bet, not for pride, not for anger. Because I choose you." Her breath caught. "Just us," he said, his voice low, gesturing to the cottonwoods around them, their leaves rustling in the dry evening breeze. "No preacher, no town, no drunks. Just you and me and the sky." I want to say the words again, and I want to mean them this time. Tears sprang to her eyes, hot and sudden. She, who had been so strong, so contained, was undone by this, by his need to make it right. She nodded, unable to speak. She just squeezed his hands. He smiled, a rare, slow smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Tomorrow, then, at sundown." She agreed. They did not get their ceremony. The next afternoon, as the sun began its long, dusty descent, a rider appeared, not a neighbor, not a drifter. Clara saw him first from the cabin window, a tall, black-clad figure on a strong black horse. Her stomach turned to ice. "Eli," she called, her voice tight. "We have a visitor." Eli came to the door, took one look, and his hand instinctively went to the gun belt he now wore every day. "Stay inside," he said. But Clara followed him out onto the small porch. She would not hide. Not anymore. Preacher Loring reined in his horse 10 feet from the cabin. He looked at the hard-packed dirt, the newly mended fence on the corral, the small, struggling garden Clara had somehow kept alive with creek water. He looked at his daughter, standing beside the rough cowboy, and his face was a mask of cold fury. "Clara May," he said, his voice the one he used to pronounce damnation. "You will pack your things. You are coming home." Clara stood very still. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face. "This is my home, Father." "This is a hovel." He spat. "You are living in sin with a drunkard and a gambler. The entire town knows the story. You were married for a bet." A $50 humiliation. You have shamed my name. You have shamed your mother's memory. And you have shamed the house of God. I have shamed no one, Clara said, her voice shaking but hard. I have built a life. I am a wife. You are a fool, he thundered. The marriage is a mockery. It has no standing, not in the eyes of God, and not in the eyes of the law. I am here to annul it, to bring you back, to cleanse you of this filth. Cleanse me. Clara took a step forward, her hands clenched. You never cared if I was cleansed. You only cared if I was seen. You let them call me cursed. You let them whisper. You stood by while I suffocated. This man, she put her hand on Eli's arm. This man, whatever his sins, he has stood by me. He has stood for me. I am not leaving. You will, the preacher insisted, his face purple. It is my right. You are my daughter. The church commands it. I command it. He made to dismount. That's far enough. Preacher! Eli's voice was quiet, but it stopped the man cold. Eli stepped forward, placing himself between the preacher and Clara. He was not the boy who had buried his brother. He was not the drifter who had taken a bet. He was a husband, defending his home. You're right about one thing, Eli said, his eyes locked on Loring's. The town does talk. They talk about the bet. They talk about me. But they also talk about you. They talk about the preacher who let his own girl wither. They talk about the man who cared more for his Bible than his blood. You will not speak to me. I will, Eli interrupted, his voice like granite. You talk about the law. You talk about God. But you don't know the first thing about either. You don't own her. You never did. She is my wife. And this is our land. You will turn that horse around, and you will not come back. For a long, terrible moment, the two men stared at each other. The preacher, his authority absolute in his own world, and the cowboy, who had no authority but his own will. Preacher Loring looked at his daughter. He saw the defiance in her eyes, the protective, possessive hand of the man beside her. He saw that she was lost to him. He pulled his horse's head around, his face a terrible, cold mask. You have made your bed in filth. Clara May, you will die in it. You are no daughter of mine. He spurred his horse and rode away, a black speck disappearing into the brown, dusty haze. Clara let out the breath she had been holding, her legs trembling. Eli's arm came around her, pulling her against his side. He's gone, he said. Yes, she whispered, leaning into his strength. But she knew, with a cold certainty, that it was not over. Her father had left, but the town remained. And the town, fueled by the preacher's righteous fury, began to show its teeth. It was not open. It was quiet. It was cowardly. A week later, Eli rode out to check the new spring he had dug. He found the fence line cut, not just in one place, but in 3. His cattle, the 20-odd head that were their entire future, were gone. Scattered into the dry hills, it took him 2 days to find them, 2 precious days of riding his horse on scant water, his leg aching. He brought them back, his face grim, and spent another day mending the fence. A few days after that, Clara rode to town for supplies. She was to trade her salves for salt and flour. She tied Promise to the rail. When she came out of the mercantile, where Mrs. Gable had refused to serve her, she found that someone had cut her cinch strap, cut it nearly all the way through. If she had mounted and ridden, the saddle would have slipped. Throwing her, she stood there, her hands shaking, staring at the deliberate, malicious cut. It was a message. They wanted her gone, or they wanted her hurt. She led Promise all the way home, the 50-mile walk, a long, terrifying meditation. When Eli saw her, leading the horse, his face went white with a fury that was colder than his jealousy. He examined the strap. This is his work, Eli said, his voice a low growl. Your father's, or his flock, Clara whispered, sitting on the stool, her legs aching. It doesn't matter. They won't stop. That night, they sat at the table. The small cabin a fortress in a hostile land. The drought, the hard work. It was one thing. This was a siege. "They mean to drive us out. Eli," Clara said, her voice hollow. "They won't," he said, slamming his fist on the table. "This is our place. I won't let them. How can you stop them? You can't stay awake every night. You can't watch every fence post, every tool." She pointed to the shed. "They broke the handle on your axe. They sabotaged the well bucket." He had no answer. Clara felt the old, familiar tightness in her chest. The walls were closing in. The world was shrinking again. 2 days later, she went to the creek, to the hollowed-out cottonwood where she had once hidden her wildflowers. She had gone there to think, tucked into the hollow. There was something new. It was a small, beaded pouch. She had not seen one in years. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single, blue jay feather and a small, dried bundle of sage. She knew what it was. It was a sign, a message. She sank to the ground, the pouch in her hand, and the past, a part of her life she had buried even from Eli, came rushing back. It had been 4 years ago. She was 15. She had been by this very creek, gathering herbs, when she heard the shouting. A mob from town, drunk and vicious, had cornered someone. It was a young native girl, no older than herself, who had been separated from her family. They were calling her a savage, a thief. They were holding rocks. Clara, the silent, ghost-touched girl, had done the one brave thing in her life. She had run into the middle of them, her arms out, and stood in front of the girl. She had screamed at them. She had called them cowards, sinners, and hypocrites. They were so stunned by her defiance, by the preacher's odd daughter suddenly finding a voice of thunder, that they had hesitated. In that hesitation, Clara had grabbed the girl's hand and run up the creek bed, into the rocks, and hidden her. She had hidden her for 2 days in a small cave, bringing her water and food, until the girl's tribe, searching, had found them. The girl's name was Morning Star. Her people had looked at Clara with a deep, silent gratitude. They had vanished, and Clara had never spoken of it. But the incident had cemented her strangeness. She had consorted with savages. She was a witch. She was not to be trusted. It was the true root of her cursed name. This pouch, it was from them. It meant they were near. It meant they remembered. It was an offer of refuge. She could leave. She could take Eli and go, disappear into the high plains, and be safe with them. She went back to the cabin. Eli was cleaning his rifle, his movements sharp, angry. "Eli," she said, her voice shaking. She held out the pouch. He looked at it, then at her. "What is this?" she told him. She told him everything. About the girl, the mob, the town's hatred, and about her herbs. "It wasn't just my mother," she confessed, the words tumbling out. "It's me. I know things. I know the plants. I know how to fix things. Like your leg. They called me a witch for it. My father beat me for it. He said it was the devil's work." She was pacing now, the tiny cabin too small for her fear. "He said it was the same sin that killed my mother, that she was vain, that she thought she knew better than God. And when I helped that girl, he said I was just like her, cursed, tainted." She stopped, her back to him, her hands covering her face. "And I'm so afraid, Eli, afraid of them," he said, his voice soft. "We can go. We can take this offer. We can leave this cursed place." "No," she whispered, turning to him, her eyes wide with a terror that went beyond the town, beyond her father. "I'm afraid of me. I'm afraid of what they said, that I'm like my mother." He looked confused. "You're strong. Clara, you're a healer. She died in childbirth." "Eli," she cried, the words finally tearing free. "She died in her own blood, on the floor, because of me, because she brought a child into the world. And they all say I carry her curse. What if we—" She couldn't say it. She couldn't speak the word baby. It was a death sentence. To bring a child into this world was to die, just like her mother. It was her fate. It was the curse. Eli stared at her. He was shaken. He had known her fear of the town, her anger at her father, But this was a dread so deep, so absolute, that it ruled her. He finally understood her terror on their wedding night. He understood her silence, her distance. She was not just afraid of him. She was afraid of life itself. He took a step and gripped her arms, his hands gentle but firm. "I don't know much. Clara may," he said, his voice thick. "I ain't a learned man, and I ain't got no patience for God. Not your father's God. Anyway," he looked at her, his sharp eyes demanding she meet his. "But I know this. You are not your mother. You are not cursed. You are the strongest woman I have ever known. You stitched me up. You saved those children from their own ignorance. You saved me from myself. But, Eli, the risk." "Aye," he said. "There's a risk. There's a risk in every breath we take in this land. The drought, the cattle, the town. This is a choice. Our choice." He was trembling, his own fear now surfacing. "I'm scared, too," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm scared of this town. I'm scared of losing this ranch. I'm scared of failing you." He pulled her closer. "But if you ever carry my child, it will not be a curse. It will not be fate. It will be because we both chose it, and we will face it together. It's our choice. Clara, not your father's, not the town's, ours." He had taken her deepest, darkest terror, the one that had defined her entire life, and he had not dismissed it. He had shared it. He had taken it from the realm of curses and fate and placed it in the realm of choice. He had given her back her own life. She looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time, not as the man from the bet, not as her husband, but as her partner, her Eli. The fear did not vanish, but it no longer had power over her. She lifted a trembling hand and touched his face, her thumb tracing the hard line of his jaw. "You stayed?" she whispered, the words a marvel. "I stayed," he agreed, his voice rough. She kissed him. It was not the kiss of their argument, born of fury and confession. It was not the desperate, wordless claiming of their first winter. It was slow. It was tender. It was the first time. He kissed her as if she were precious, as if she were a miracle. She kissed him as if he were an anchor, the only true thing in a world of lies. He lifted her into his arms, his movements slow, deliberate, and carried her to the bed. They undressed each other in the dim light of the cabin, their eyes never leaving each other's. There was no shame. There were no ghosts. They made love slowly, with a reverence that was its own kind of prayer. It was a complete union. Every touch was a discovery. Every kiss was a promise. For the first time in the small, besieged cabin, in the heart of the unforgiving prairie, they were fully present and fully seen, and it was enough. The drought, which had strangled the prairie for months, had made the world a tinderbox. The grasses were cured and brittle. The leaves on the cottonwoods were dry as paper. All it took was a spark. It came from the south, from a careless hunter or a lightning strike. No one ever knew, but it came with a vengeance. Clara saw it first, not as fire, but as a smudge of greasy, brown smoke on the far horizon, blotting out the metallic blue of the sky. By midday, the smudge had become a roiling, dark cloud, and the sun was a dull, red coin. The wind, which had been their enemy for weeks, now turned accomplice, pushing the flames north, straight toward the scattered homesteads. Eli stood on the porch, his face grim, sniffing the air. It smelled of ash and something ancient, something full of fear. "It's moving fast," he said. Silas rode up, his horse lathered. "Eli, it's jumped the dry bed of the Laramie. It's coming for the whole range. We're gathering every man. We've got to try and make a fire break at the ridge." Eli nodded, already moving. He grabbed his saddle, his axe, and a shovel. Clara's heart seized. "Eli!" He stopped and looked at her. He walked back, his face hard, and pulled her into a quick, rough embrace. "Barricade the door. Keep the horses close. Soak blankets in the well water and put them on the roof if the embers start to fall. I'll be back." "Be careful," she whispered, her voice tight, clinging to his shirt. "I'm always careful," he said. He kissed her, hard, a kiss that tasted of dust and smoke, and then he was on his horse, riding into the haze with Silas, toward the pulsing, orange glow that was now visible beneath the smoke. He was gone for 3 days. The first day, Clara worked. She did as he said, hauling bucket after bucket of precious water from the dwindling well, climbing the ladder, and soaking the sod roof and the blankets she had spread. The cabin was a small, damp fortress. The air grew thick, hot, and hard to breathe. Ash, white and gray, began to fall like a diseased snow. The second day, the world was a red twilight. The sun was gone. The smoke was so thick she could not see the corral from the cabin door. Her lungs ached. Her eyes burned. Promise, the mare, and Eli's horse whinnied in terror from the small, protected lean-to. She sat on the porch, a wet cloth over her face, her rifle across her knees, and waited. She did not sleep. She watched the glowing, hellish ridgeline, miles away, and prayed to a God she no longer trusted. The third day, the wind shifted. It blew the smoke back, revealing a landscape of black and gray. The ridge was a charred ruin. The fire had passed them, moved northeast. The immediate danger was over. But Eli did not come. She waited all day. The red twilight faded, replaced by the natural descent of evening. But the sky was still hazy, the air still poisoned. He should have been back. Even if he was just checking the herd, he should have been back. She walked to the edge of their small pasture, staring into the bruised, smoky dusk. He was gone. The fire, it moved so fast, a horse could stumble, a man could be trapped, surrounded by a ring of flames. She thought of him, his face covered in soot, calling her name in the roar of the fire. She thought of him lying on the charred ground, his horse fallen beside him, and the realization, which had been budding in her heart for months, bloomed in a terrible, agonizing clarity. The bet, the shame, her father's cruelty. None of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the man who had ridden into that smoke, the man who had fixed her roof, the man who had told her she was not cursed, the man who had taken her deepest fear and shared it. The thought of a world without him, a world without his rough hands, his quiet presence, his stubborn, loyal heart. It was not a world she could breathe in. It was an emptiness she could not face. She sank to her knees in the dusty yard, the place where he had stood against her father. She covered her face with her hands, and a dry, racking sob tore through her. It was a grief so profound, so absolute, it hollowed her out. "I love you," she whispered to the empty, smoking prairie. "Eli, I love you. Please come back." She was overwhelmed, broken by the sudden, terrifying weight of her own heart. She loved him. She loved her husband, Eli Ramsey, and she had never told him. She stayed there, in the dirt, until the moon, a pale, sick yellow, rose in the haze. She was a hollow shell. She had lost him, just as she had lost her mother. The curse was real, after all. She was fated to lose everything she touched. She was so lost in her grief that she did not hear the footsteps, uneven and slow, stumbling through the dark. She did not hear the pained grunt until he was almost upon her. A figure emerged from the haze. He was not on a horse. He was a man, barely standing, covered head to foot in black soot, his shirt hanging in burnt tatters. He was limping, using a charred stick as a crutch. He stopped, seeing her kneeling in the dirt. "Clara?" he rasped, his voice a ruin. She looked up. It was Eli. She did not scream. She did not cry out. She simply moved. She was on her feet, running, scrambling across the yard. He saw her coming and he dropped the stick, his legs finally giving out. He sank to his knees, and she crashed into him, throwing her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. He was real. He was solid. He smelled of ash and sweat and burnt hair, and he was alive. His arms came around her, his grip desperate, pulling her tight. He was burnt. His arms were red and blistered. His face was streaked with soot and tears. I thought, she sobbed, her words muffled against his neck. The fire! I thought you were dead! I lost my horse," he choked out, his body trembling with exhaustion. The wind, it turned, trapped us, had to run through it. I thought of you. I just kept walking." They knelt in the dirt of their homestead, two survivors clinging to each other, and they cried. They cried for the fear, for the days lost, for the brush with death. They cried for the sheer, desperate, agonizing relief of being alive, and together. She pulled back, her hands framing his face, her thumbs wiping the soot from his cheeks. He was bruised. He was burnt. He was beautiful. He looked at her, his sharp eyes softened by pain and a profound, exhausted love. She didn't need to say the words. He saw it in her face. He had seen her grief, and now he saw her truth. Back in the cabin, she worked with a gentle, focused intensity. She cut away the remnants of his shirt. His back and arms were blistered, but the burns were not deep. She cleaned them, her touch feather-light, spreading her own cooling salve of aloe and comfrey over his raw skin. He sat at the table, his body slumped, his eyes never leaving her. They did not speak. They did not need to. The fire had burned away everything false. The bet, the shame, the arguments. It was all ash. All that was left was the truth. She cleaned his face. She washed his hair. She tended to his twisted ankle. When she was done, she helped him to the bed. He was asleep almost before his head hit the pillow. Clara sat in the stool, watching him breathe, her heart so full it ached. That night, she woke to his touch. He was awake, his eyes clear in the moonlight, watching her. He reached out, his hand rough but gentle, and traced the line of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, and the passion that rose between them was not the hungry, desperate anger of their first nights, nor the tender, questioning intimacy of their healing. It was something new. It was a deep, unchained, and wordless thing. It was the absolute, profound knowledge of what it meant to almost lose everything. It was a complete union, a fire of its own, but one that did not destroy. It forged. A week passed. Eli healed. His skin was scarred, but his strength returned. The homestead was safe, but the town was not. Silas rode out again, his face troubled. "Clara, Eli," he said, twisting his hat in his hands. "There's a town meeting. Tonight, in the church." Eli, mending a bridle on the porch, looked up. "What about?" "About you," Silas said, avoiding their eyes. "Preacher Loring, he's using the fire. He's telling folks it was a judgment from God. Judgment for the town sheltering you. He's calling for your expulsion. Says you defied him, that you're a moral danger to the town." Clara came to the door, a wet dishcloth in her hand. Her father, he was using God to finish the fight he had lost. "He's calling for a vote," Silas finished, finally looking at them. "To ban you from Laramie, to run you off your land." Eli stood up. He strapped on his gun belt. "We'll be there." The church was packed. It was hot, suffocating, smelling of unwashed bodies and self-righteousness. Every merchant, every ranch hand, every respectable wife was there. Mrs. Gable was in the front pew, her face a mask of sour piety. Clara's students and their families, Silas, Mary, and the others, were clustered in the back, silent, watchful, and outnumbered. Preacher Loring stood at the pulpit, his element. His voice boomed, bouncing off the rafters. "And the fire came," he thundered, his fist striking the Bible. "A cleansing fire, a judgment on our tolerance. We have harbored a sinner. We have allowed a gambler, a drunkard, a man who mocks God's holy matrimony, to live among us." He pointed a long, bony finger at Eli, who stood near the back, his arms crossed, his face like stone. "He defied me. He defied the church. He lives here, on land he has not earned, with a woman he has not honored. He is a cancer in our midst. He is a danger. And I say, we must cut him out." "Amen," shouted Mrs. Gable. "The law," Eli started, his voice a low growl. "The law of God is higher than the law of man," the preacher roared. We are a community of the righteous. We must protect ourselves. I call for a vote. All those who say this man, Eli Ramsey, and the woman who stands with him, must be expelled from this territory. Stand. Mrs. Gable stood. The banker stood. A dozen others, their faces hard and certain, rose to their feet. Eli tensed, his hand moving toward his gun, ready to fight his way out. No. Clara's voice was quiet, but it cut through the murmurs. She put her hand on Eli's arm. Stopping him, she began to walk. She walked down the center aisle, her footsteps the only sound in the suddenly silent church. Her father stared, his mouth open, stunned by her audacity. She did not stop at a pew. She walked all the way to the front, standing beside the pulpit, facing the crowd, facing her town. She was not the ghost-touched girl. She was not the cursed wife. She was Mrs. Eli Ramsey. I was the cursed girl, she said, her voice clear, trembling only slightly. For 19 years, you all called me that. You whispered when I passed. You told your children not to speak to me. She looked directly at Mrs. Gable. You called me ghost-touched and strange. You never offered me a kind word, not once. She turned her gaze to her father. And you, Father, you let them. You spoke of sin, but you never spoke of kindness. You let me starve, as long as I was silent. The church was stone quiet. You are right about one thing, she continued, her voice gaining strength. My husband, Eli Ramsey, did a terrible thing. He married me for a bet, for $50 and a laugh. A shocked, satisfied murmur went through the pews. They had confirmation. But he stayed, Clara said, her voice rising, silencing them. He stayed when this town and my own father would have let me rot. He fixed our roof. He dug our well. He built a shelter for my horse. And when that fire came, the fire you call God's judgment, he rode into it. He rode into it to save your homes. Silas's home, the Croft place. He fought that fire for 3 days, while you prayed. She pointed a finger, just as her father had. You speak of sinners? Mr. Gable, you speak of sin, but you short-weigh your flour, and I have seen it. Mrs. Gable gasped. And you, Mr. Henderson, she said to another man. You speak of morals? You cut my cinch strap. You tried to harm me. Is that your righteousness? This is slander, the preacher roared, finding his voice. She is a witch, a liar. Am I? Clara turned on him. You speak of God's law, but you know nothing of God's mercy. You speak of hypocrisy. You, who would use a natural disaster to settle a personal score. You are the hypocrite. Clara's right. A voice, thin and reedy, came from the back. It was Mary Croft, Silas's wife, a woman who never spoke. She stood up, her hands trembling. The preacher, he talks of sin, she said, her voice shaking. My husband, he beat me. For 5 years. I went to the preacher. I had bruises. She looked at Preacher Loring. He told me to be an obedient wife. He told me to pray harder. He never helped me. The church was frozen. This was a secret, but a known one. Mary Croft looked at Clara. The church never helped, but Mrs. Ramsey, she saw my face. She came to my home. She gave me a salve for the bruises. She just sat with me. She talked to me. She was kind. Another woman stood, one of the homesteaders. And she's teaching my boy to read, for nothing, for eggs. Silas stood up, his face set. Eli Ramsey fought the fire at my place. He saved my herd and my barn. He is no sinner. He's a neighbor, and he's a better Christian than any of you. The tide, which had been so certain, had turned. The homesteaders were standing. The town merchants were looking at each other, their certainty shaken. The preacher's power, built on fear and judgment, had cracked. He stared at his congregation, then at his daughter, his face a mask of disbelief and pure hatred. Clara walked back to Eli. He took her hand, his eyes shining with a pride so fierce it hurt. They turned, and together, they walked out of the church, leaving the fractured, silent town behind. They rode home in the twilight, exhausted, but breathing free air. They had won. They had faced the town, and they had won. They reached the homestead as the last light faded. The cabin was a dark, safe silhouette against the stars. "We're home," Eli said, his voice thick. As he moved to dismount, a voice came from the shadows of the corral. Well. Look at the $50 bride, and the fool who paid for her." Clara's blood went cold. Eli froze. Jeb and Cully stepped out, but they were not alone. 2 other men, strangers with hard faces and rifles, stepped out with them. They were not just drunk, they were armed, and they were greedy. "You cost us a lot of money, Ramsey." Jeb said he was no longer the town bully. He was a thief. "That was a fine pot you won, and then you welched on the real bet. We heard you was running cattle. We heard you got a nice little place here. We figured you owe us that $50. With interest. A lot of interest." "You ain't taking anything," Eli said, sliding from his horse. He moved slowly, pushing Clara behind him. "This ain't your fight." "It is now," Jeb sneered. "The woman, too," one of the strangers said, his voice flat, his rifle leveling. "She's pretty. She can be part of the price." He aimed, not at Eli, at Clara. Eli didn't think. He shoved her, hard, throwing her off her horse into the ground, just as the rifle shot exploded. The sound tore the night. Eli grunted, a sharp, punched-out sound, and spun, clutching his side. He was hit. Even as he fell, he drew his pistol, firing back at the man who had shot him. It all happened at once. Cully, seeing Eli down, lunged for Clara, who was scrambling in the dirt. One of the strangers raised his pistol. Clara screamed, but it was a scream of rage. Not fear. She saw Eli, bleeding. She saw the men coming. She would not lose him. She grabbed a heavy piece of firewood from the stack by the door and swung it with all her strength. Catching Cully square in the knee, he howled, his leg buckling. The standoff was broken. Eli, on one knee, fired again, and the second stranger dropped his rifle, clutching his shoulder. Jeb, a coward at heart, saw it had all gone wrong. He turned to run. "No!" Clara shrieked. She scrambled to Eli's side, grabbing his fallen rifle. She was shaking, covered in dirt, but her eyes were fire. She leveled the heavy gun at the fleeing men. "Get out!" she screamed, her voice a raw, tearing sound. "Get out or I will kill you myself! Get off our land!" She was no one's victim. She was no one's ghost. Jeb and the remaining stranger, stunned by the fury of the woman they had called a witch, didn't hesitate. They grabbed the howling Cully and disappeared into the darkness. Silence fell, thick and sudden, broken only by Cully's fading cries and the ragged sound of breathing. Clara dropped the rifle and fell to her knees beside Eli. He was on his side, his hand pressed to his ribs, blood seeping through his fingers. His face was pale, beaded with sweat. "Clara," he gasped, his eyes finding hers. You should have run." "Hush," she ordered, her voice shaking but firm, already tearing her skirt to make a bandage. "I told you, you stay." She pressed the cloth to the wound. It was high on his side. Messy, but maybe not fatal. If she was fast. "I'm not losing you," she said, her voice fierce, as much a promise to herself as to him. "I'm not losing another man to pride. I'm not losing you to blood." She used her herbs. She used her grit. She used her stubborn, hard-won will. She would not be her mother. She would not be a victim of fate. She would choose. She chose him. She would save her husband. The bullet had passed clean through. That was the first miracle. Eli was tough, forged from prairie grit and hard luck, but the blood he lost was considerable. Clara, however, was no longer a girl, and certainly not a ghost. She was a healer. She was a wife, fighting for her own. She packed the wound with yarrow to stop the bleeding and bound it tight, her hands steady. She hauled him into the cabin, his arm draped over her shoulder, his body a dead weight. She laid him on their bed, the bed where he had first claimed her in anger, and where he had later chosen her in truth. For 10 days, she did not leave his side. She was a fierce guardian. She fought the fever with willow bark tea. She cleaned the wound with boiled water and her strongest herbal washes. She hunted for their food, taking a rabbit with Eli's rifle, her aim surprisingly true. She realized, her own woman. She had been all along. The town, the one that had tried to expel them, now came to them. Mary Croft arrived first, her face pale, carrying a fresh-baked loaf of bread and a jar of broth. "I heard," she whispered, looking at Eli's pale, sleeping form. "Is he?" "He will be," Clara said, her voice firm, accepting the gifts. "He is strong." "Clara," Mary said, twisting her hands. "The preacher, he's gone. He left town the day after the meeting, packed his bags. He told Mr. Gable the town was a nest of vipers and he was abandoning it to God's wrath." Clara just nodded, the news landing with a dull, final thud. Her father was gone. She felt nothing, a cold, empty space. He had left her long ago. Silas came next, with 2 other homesteaders. They were armed, their faces grim. "We'll stand watch, Clara, a few nights. Make sure that trash don't come back." "They won't be back," Eli rasped from the bed. He was awake, his eyes open, sharp and clear. They were cowards. They got what they came for, just not what they expected. Clara rushed to him, a cup of water in her hand. The homesteaders saw the look on her face, the quiet authority in her, and the raw-boned man in the bed who was clearly on the mend. They saw a home, not a hovel. They saw a marriage, not a bet. "Well," Silas said, nodding with respect, "we'll be checking in. You need anything. Mrs. Ramsey, you send your boy Tom." Clara smiled. "Thank you, Silas." Months passed. The wound on Eli's side healed, leaving a ragged, puckered scar that Clara would trace with her fingers in the quiet of the night. The winter came, a hard one, but for the first time, the cabin felt large enough. It was filled not with silence and shame, but with the sounds of their life. The quiet scrape of Clara's pencil as she wrote lesson plans, the thump of Eli's axe as he split wood, the murmur of their voices as they sat by the fire. The drought had broken with the autumn rains, and the fire, though brutal, had cleared the dead brush. When spring arrived, it came with a wild, desperate, beautiful life. The prairie, fertilized by the ash, exploded in a carpet of bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush. Clara's school was no longer a secret. It was an institution. The homesteaders, who had sided with her against the preacher, now sent their children openly. There were 6 of them, from young Tom Croft, now reading the newspaper aloud, to 6-year-old Sarah, just learning her letters. They sat on the cabin floor, a row of bright, eager faces, and Clara, who had been raised in the shadow of a cruel book, taught them the joy of words. They paid her in what they had: a sack of potatoes, a dozen eggs, a mended blanket. It was a community, forged not from piety, but from shared hardship and mutual respect. Eli's cattle herd was smaller, but stronger. He'd found a half-dozen strays, thin and branded by ranches that had folded. But his prize was a young colt, orphaned in the fire, that he had found sheltering in the rocks. His coat singed. Eli had nursed the colt, and it now followed him like a dog. He called it Ash. He, too, had taken in an orphan. Young Ben Croft, Tom's older brother, was 15 and restless. His father, Silas, was a good man, but a farmer, not a rancher. Eli took the boy on, teaching him how to read the land, how to mend a fence, how to gentle a horse. Eli, who had no family, was becoming a father to the lost, a quiet patriarch of the high, lonely prairie. Life had settled into a rhythm, a hard rhythm, but a good one. There was work, and there was food, and there was the steady, quiet presence of each other. That autumn, Clara knew she was pregnant. She had missed her time, and a quiet, cautious hope had blowed in her. She had told Eli, her voice trembling, and he had simply held her, his hand resting on her stomach, his face a mask of awe and terror and a deep, quiet joy. They were choosing this, together. But the curse, the fear that had haunted her, had one last cruel blow to land. It happened in the deep of winter. There was no storm, no violence, just a deep, abiding cold. She woke in the night to a sharp, familiar cramping. A dread, cold and absolute, seized her. She got out of bed, her hand to her mouth, and she knew, by morning, it was over. The small, nascent life was gone. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply shut down. The ghost-touched girl returned. She sat on the stool, her hands in her lap, and stared at the cabin wall. She was her mother. She was cursed. Fate was a circle, and it had finally claimed her. All her fighting, all her love, it was for nothing. She was destined to be barren, to be a vessel of death. Eli was lost. He tried to talk to her, to touch her. She flinched. He brought her broth. She would not eat. He sat beside her, helpless, his own grief a heavy stone in his chest. But it was nothing to the dark, empty void she had fallen into. He found her, 3 days later, by the creek, near the cottonwoods. She was just standing there, her thin shawl pulled tight, staring at the frozen water. He stood beside her, not touching. "It's true," she whispered, her voice a dead thing. "What they said, what my father said. I am empty. I am a curse." Eli looked at her, his heart breaking. He had no words. He was not a man of comfort or theology. He was a man of action. He left her there. He went to the shed, got his pickaxe and a shovel. He went to the stand of cottonwoods, a few yards from where she stood. The ground was frozen, hard as iron. He began to dig. Clara watched, numb. The sound of the pick striking the frozen earth was the only sound. It was brutal, exhausting work. He fought the ground for 2 hours, his breath pluming, sweat freezing on his brow. He dug a small, neat hole, 2 feet deep. Then he went to the cabin and came back with a small, linen-wrapped bundle she had hidden, the evidence of her failure. He knelt by the hole. He unwrapped it, looked at it for a long, aching moment. Then he rewrapped it and placed it gently in the earth. He shoveled the frozen dirt back. He found heavy stones and built a small, careful cairn over the spot. He had not said a word. He walked back to her. He was covered in sweat, his hands raw. He did not try to hold her. He just looked at her, his face carved with a shared grief. "It ain't a curse," he said, his voice rough. "It's a loss, and it's ours. It ain't a secret. It ain't a shame. It's a grave, and we will honor it." He had taken her deepest, darkest shame, the one she would have hidden under the floorboards of her mind, and he had given it a place. He had made it real. He had shared it. Clara looked at the small pile of stones, and the ice inside her finally, painfully, cracked. She leaned forward, pressed her face into his rough, sweat-damp shirt, and she wept. He held her, his arms an iron, unshakable band, and let her cry until she was empty. When spring came, Eli rode for a full day. He came back with a small wild plum sapling, its roots bundled in wet burlap. He planted it over the small grave. Life resumed. The loss was there, a scar on their hearts. But like Eli's scar on his side, it was a part of them. It was not a thing that would destroy them. A year passed. The ranch held. Their love, which had been born in violence and tested by fire, now settled, deep and strong, into the earth. One night, a summer storm, violent and sudden, broke over the plains. The thunder was a cannonade, shaking the small cabin. Rain lashed the windows. It was a storm like their wedding night. Clara cried out, sitting bolt upright in bed. "Clara, what is it? You're safe!" Eli's voice, instant, pulling her back. He lit the lamp. She was trembling, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "The dream," she panted, her hands clutching his arms. "It was all of it. The wedding, the mud, Jeb, my father in the church, the fire, the blood." She choked on a sob. "The blood! Oh, Eli, the blood!" "Shh," he said, pulling her against his chest, his hand stroking her hair. "It's just the storm. Clara May, it's just a bad dream. It's over. All of it. We're here. We're safe." She clung to him, the sound of the rain a counterpoint to her ragged breathing. She was in the cabin, in his arms. The walls were strong. The roof did not leak. She pulled back, looking at him in the lamplight. She saw the scar on his side. She saw the lines of care on his face, lines she had put there. She saw his eyes, sharp and clear, full of a love she had never believed she deserved. They sat there for a long time, listening to the storm rage outside, their safe, small world. "We lost so much," she whispered, her hand tracing the scar on his side. "His brother, our baby." "Aye," he said, his voice thick. "We did." He took her hand, kissed her calloused knuckles. "But we kept this. We kept the ranch. We have Tom and the others. We have the spring. We have us." The fire in the stove crackled. The rain began to soften. She looked at him, at this man who had been her betrayer, her captor, her patient, her defender, her husband, the sheer, improbable miracle of him. "You stayed," she whispered, the word still a marvel, the single, defining truth of her life. Eli looked at her, his gaze deep, holding all the nights of their past and all the mornings of their future. He leaned in and kissed her, slowly, deliberately, a prayer. "Not just stayed," he replied, his voice a low, rough vow against her lips. "I chose you in that saloon. Clara, though I was too drunk and too blind to know it. I chose you in the storm. I chose you when you faced down your father. I chose you in the fire. And I chose you when you held that gun on Jeb. I choose you every morning when I wake up, again and again. Clara May." He kissed her again. And it was a promise. It was the renewing of the vows they had never truly spoken under the cottonwoods. Another spring came, the plum tree by the creek, the one over the small, sacred grave, burst into a cloud of white, fragrant blossoms. The ranch was thriving. Clara was standing on the porch, watching the children run home, when she felt it, the familiar, quiet, terrifying sign. She had missed her time. She stood very still, her hand on her belly. The fear was there. It would always be there. The memory of the blood, the shadow of her mother. But it was not the cold, paralyzing dread of before. It was just a feeling, an uncertainty. She found Eli by the corral, branding Ash, who was now a strong, handsome yearling. He was whistling, a tuneless, quiet sound. She walked up to him. He turned, smiling when he saw her. "Clara May." She did not speak. She just took his rough, calloused, soot-stained hand. She brought it to her stomach and held it there. He froze. His smile faded, replaced by a look of stunned, profound awe. He looked at her hand, then at her belly, then, finally, into her eyes. He saw the uncertainty there. He saw the old shadow, but he also saw her strength. She was not the cursed girl. She was his wife. She did not flinch. She just nodded. Once. He pulled her to him, his embrace fierce, burying his face in her hair. He was afraid, but he was not afraid for her. He was afraid with her. And that made all the difference. "It's our choice," he whispered. "Ours," she agreed, her voice muffled against his chest, her arms wrapped around him, unafraid. The final scene, the one that stays, is not of a grand passion. It is of a quiet evening. Late in that summer, the ranch is blooming, the pastures green and knee-high. Clara, her body full and heavy with new life, stands on the porch, her hands resting on the swell. She watches Eli, who is teaching young Ben how to mend a harness. Eli looks up, sees her watching, and smiles. He wipes his hands on his pants and walks to her. He does not speak, just comes to stand beside her, his arm settling around her waist, his hand coming to rest protectively on her belly. They stand side by side, looking out at their land, their home. The air is warm, the world quiet, full of the hum of life. In the far, distant hills, thunder rolls. A summer storm, miles away. A reminder that the world is still wild, that peace is never permanent. But Eli's arm is a solid, warm weight. Clara leans her head on his shoulder. They are weathered. They are scarred. But they are unbroken. They are two people standing together against the thunder, still choosing each other in a world that had tried and failed to break them. Thank you for listening to this story. I truly appreciate you spending your time with Clara May and Eli. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please feel free to comment and say hello. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of the grit, heart, and survival of the American frontier. And finally, share your thoughts in English. What did you think of their journey? I look forward to reading your words.